Hello, Rutkan. This is Rizan from Malaysia. I'm the Cyber Lead Penetration Tester from BAE Systems. For today's disclosure, I would like to discuss about my topic, OAuth Authentication Bypass. For the agenda, I will go through the first overview of the OAuth implicit flow, after which we'll talk a bit about statistics, meaning what we see out there. And we'll talk a bit about the vulnerability research that we have done with regards to this OAuth misconfiguration that allows that attacker to bypass authentication. And last but not least, at the end of this talk, I would be taking questions and I will try my very best to answer all your questions. Firstly, let's go through the overview. What is OAuth? Now, you guys might have seen this. I'm very sure if you use the internet, if you use the web, you will see signs like login with Google, login with Facebook, login with whatever, Twitter. Now, this is a mechanism that allows a user to authenticate himself in an automated fashion using your social media profile. Now, the traditional way of logging in a system is the username and password. Everyone knows that. You know your username, you get the correct password, and you're logged in. Now, many times we have just too many username and passwords to remember. Hence, we have this automated system called the OAuth, where it allows a website developer to integrate the authentication with a provider. Now, the provider can be Facebook, can be Google, can be Twitter, can be LinkedIn, it can be whatever OAuth provider that's out there. Now, this is what OAuth is all about, and this is what the topic is all about. We're going to be discussing a bit about some of the misconfiguration. One particular misconfiguration that is often seen out there. Most bug hunters would have seen it, but I'm trying to put things into perspective. Firstly, let's have a look at the OAuth 2 implicit flow. Over here is a diagram that I drew. Well, actually, I stole this diagram, but anyways, the client application is on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side, you have the resource owner. At the bottom, you have the authorization server and the resource server. To put things into perspective, the resource owner is usually the user, like you and me. Someone that would like to log into a website would log into the client application. So in this case, the client application is the website. Let's assume for a second here that we are trying to log into website abc.com. Now, a user would usually submit a username and a password, and the authorization grant will happen. As you can see here, there are many arrows pointing left and right. What happens is the client application will pop up with that little window that I showed you in the first diagram just now. And you enter the username and password, it gets passed back to the client application. That's called an authorization grant. And from there, the authorization grant is passed to an authorization server. Now, pay attention over here. The authorization server in this case could be Facebook, could be Google, could be Twitter, could be whatever not. Now, the flaw is not in the authorization server. There were cases, one particular case where the authorization server made a mistake and a bug hunter had found this vulnerability. It was in the Apple ID authentication that gave him $50,000 prize money. But in this case, in this scenario that we are discussing, it has nothing to do with the authorization server. It's at the flaw at the client application giving access into the resource server website. Now, I will speak a bit more about this vulnerability in more detail at the following slides. Now, on the fourth session here, you will see the access token that gets passed back from the authorization server. Now, the client application would send 3 parameters. Now, these 3 parameters are very important because this is the gist of the discussion that we're going to have here. Now, when the client access token has been passed back to the resource server, which is the website that you are trying to authenticate against, you will have 3 parameters: the email ID, the resource ID, and the username. In different instances, in different websites, we have different parameters that are passed back and forth. Now, we will examine how these parameters, if are unchecked, can be modified, can be intercepted by an attacker, and therefore gain access to the resource server. Now, another point, very important point that I have to emphasize here is the client application and the resource server most of the times are one unit, as in one server. It could be separate, but usually is one. So what we're talking about here is the authorization server passing back the access token. Access token is granted to the resource server, meaning abc.com, and therefore you have access to abc.com. We will examine step number 5, which is the misconfiguration, the unchecked parameters, and leading to the authentication bypass. Before that, let's look at some statistics. Some facts to understand. Only a small number of websites that offer users to sign in using the Facebook, Google, Twitter, or whatever not exhibit this problem. Now, the tester only tested against accounts, FB accounts that are already owned by the tester. This is very important because we do not want to step over other people. We do not want to break the law by accessing other people's account. So all accounts that were used for this testing were owned by the tester. Again, the emphasis is the problem is not due to the fault of the authorization server, but rather due to the unchecked parameters at step number 5 in the previous diagram. And the problem exists usually in the implicit grant of OAuth 2. Here are some statistics. Over here, you will see the name of the websites. We redacted it for privacy purposes. There were hundreds of websites that we tested. And on the top here, you will see the authorization servers that we tested against. So we have Facebook, Google, Apple, Twitter, Microsoft, LinkedIn, whatever. The ones that failed are the broken tags here. As you can see, Facebook, against all the other sites that we tested, the 200 sites here were okay. Some were not tested, some exhibit buggy behavior. Now, the authentication bypass happened in the broken tabs over here. Out of about close to 200, we got about 10 broken authentication. Again, nothing to do with the authorization server's fault, but rather the parameters that were passed back into the resource server from the client application was unchecked. We will go through each of these parameters and show you how easy it is for an attacker to intercept the packets using burp application and tamper these parameters to gain unauthorized access into anyone's account. Fortunately, out there, out of 200 websites or so, only 10 exhibit this broken behavior. Now, moving on to the research. So we spent a bit of time trying to understand what this vulnerability is about. Like I said, most people have seen it. Most bug hunters have seen it. Usually this bug would not survive more than 10 minutes in a BPP program because it's just so easy to spot and to exploit. It's just the fact that there are just so many other websites out there that might not be tested, might not have a VDP or BPP program, and the developers are unaware of this issue. We took a look at some of the OAuth pentest checklists that's available out there. Yeah, these are the standard checklists that most people do while testing for OAuth 2. Now, a lot of the checks over here we see don't really fit the bill except for one: abuse of token by a legitimate resource server or client. This is one such variant that we have seen, but actually there is more to it. And that's what we're going to discuss in the next following slides. If any of you have ever done the port swinger labs, you will notice there is one particular lab for the OAuth authentication implicit flow pen test. And if you look carefully, it's labeled as apprentice. So that shows how easy it is. Yeah, apprentice is the lowest or the easiest level of exercise there is on the Podswinger labs. And that's how easy it is. However, when we look closer at this bug that's systemic, the problem is systemic out there, it actually involves more than just tampering one parameter. It might be several parameters depending on how the authentication was coded by the developer. In this case, for Podswinger, they actually showed the easiest method of tampering one particular parameter, which I will show you at the end of the slide. Before that, just to put things into more perspective and how this vulnerability is actively exploited out there, have a look at the Hackerone Reports. Some people have submitted this vulnerability, this bug, and was awarded a bounty of $800 easily. I have submitted one and I got a bounty for about $1,000. I submitted another one, but I believe this was a duplicate. So this just shows that this problem is systemic and it's happening out there, and people are, bug hunters are actively reporting it. But again, I'd like to put into perspective what exactly is happening. Now, the parameters I mentioned in the previous slide, the 4 parameters, the email, the user ID, and whatnot, I have put them according to the difficulty of exploiting it. From the top, the most difficult one is the app scope user ID. Now, the app scope user ID is a 15-digit number that gets randomly generated by the client app. And it's pretty much, I would say, difficult to brute force, being a 15-digit number, but not entirely impossible if the attacker has means or time to brute force the entire or a range of valid digits, user ID. And once he hit the correct 15-digit app user ID, he would be able to access the resource server, which is in this case, abc.com. Now, going down the list, a much easier approach if the developer has not checked the token. The access token that I showed in the previous slide was the token granted by the authorization server. In this case, it could be Twitter, Google, or Facebook. That access token can be reused on any websites where they do not check the validity of the access token and just blindly accept it. I will show in the following slides how an attacker could exploit this in a real scenario. Going down the ladder to an even easier exploitation technique would be the resource ID. Now, the resource ID is usually a primary key, could be a unique username that gets created upon registration of a user for a particular website. It can be an email, it can just be a random digit or a random value like user 123 or user Rizan or whatever. This is easily guessed. I'll show you in some examples where the resource ID happened to be an email address, which is publicly known. And the easiest of all would be the client email address, which what I just showed you in the Podswinger lab just now, where just by modifying the email address directly without having any access token or resource ID or app scope ID, you'll be able to access the system, the resource server. And that's by far the easiest. Again, we'll go through each one of this. And if you have any questions, we can take a step back and discuss this during the Q&A. Now, I have to do this. Normal disclaimer applies. Please do not do any unlawful or illegal activities. We do not condone, we do not take any responsibility. I heard prison is not a good place to be. So stay within your VDP, stay within your BBP programs. If you're an authorized personnel to do a pen test for a company or client, go ahead. If you're not, please do not utilize any knowledge that you have learned or seen in this disclosure today to act in an illegal manner. Good. All right, let's start talking a bit about the testing procedures. It's pretty simple. First thing you will need will be at least 2 user IDs. Why we have 2 user IDs? Because we want to show you the fact that we can access, using user 1, we can access user 2's account just by tampering some parameters. Again, I did mention in my first few slides that we did not utilize any live accounts, belonging to other people. We use accounts that belong to us, belong to the tester. So therefore, the tester created 2 usernames, 2 user IDs that belong to him, meaning we have 2 FB profiles created. Now, one thing to understand here, when we use the FB account, we decided to use FB account as a test bed because we saw that this would be the easiest, most simplest method for us to demonstrate this vulnerability. One thing to take note is the FB accounts. If you create test accounts, it will not be usable immediately after the accounts have been created. There is a 24-hour cool-off period. I believe this is done by FB to avoid rogue accounts. Therefore, if you want to do such testing, you must have the FB accounts created in advance. And once you have the FB accounts created, user 1 and user 2, go ahead and register these accounts at the target website. So in this case, we say we are testing a fictitious website called abc.com, which is our target. And after registering both accounts, we will use Burp Suite application to intercept and tamper the parameters that get parsed between the client and the resource server. When I showed you the first few diagram, step number 5 is where the 3 parameters get parsed, and those parameters, depending on how the developer had created the site, is temperable. It's unchecked. Let's go through the most difficult exploitation. App scope user ID tamper. I mentioned that it was a 15-digit ID. It's pretty long. It's pretty difficult to brute force, but not entirely impossible. So for example, when we have a website here and it's asking you, okay, you want to log in using your traditional email or password, or would you like to use Google or Facebook? In this case, we use Facebook. So using the account that we created just now, the 2 fictitious account, we logged in with the first account. Facebook will prompt you, will ask you, do you want to proceed? Continue, yes. And this is the part where we use Burp Suite to intercept the traffic. Now, if you haven't heard of Burp Suite, check it out. It's a very common application proxy used by pen testers for web pen tests. What it does is it intercepts the traffic between the browser and the server and enables the pen tester to examine and tamper the values that get parsed between the client browser and the server. So in this case, over here, we have the request on the left-hand side, and you can see the app scope user ID is 15 digits. Now, this is at step number 5, where the client application is passing the authentication key. In this case, it's called the app scope user ID to the server. If this 15-digit is valid, therefore, you will be granted a cookie and you will be able to access the system. Now, this is only applicable if you get the app user ID correct. In this case, we decided, let me show you in the next slide, to tamper the app key, app scope user ID key to the second user. Remember, I said I created 2 user accounts. First one is 15-digit ending with 421. And the second user ID created with the ending of 353. Now, if I happen to able to guess the app key, the 15-digit app key of any valid user on the resource server, I will be given access into the resource server because the resource server has just granted me a JWT access cookie over here. And it also tells me that my expiry token is set in the future. So therefore, I have access into the resource server just by tampering the app scope user ID. Again, first key over here, and the second key over here. Everything else remains the same. So that, I say, would be the most difficult one, the most difficult exploit vector, because the key is pretty long and pretty difficult to properly brute force or guess. If there's a timeout period in the session, you have to start all over again, right? Now, I would just like to also inform you that the app scope user ID is debuggable. We have this Facebook debugger. You can access it through the Facebook website. I can't remember the URL. You can Google it easily. Now, by entering the access token over here, you can actually debug the information that was given to you by the authorization server. It will tell you the app ID and the app scope user ID. So every time you enter a different access key over here, in this case, we use 2 user accounts that we created, we can actually see the data or the metadata that is attached to this access key, right? Everything, again, everything remains the same. All I did was modify the app scope user ID with the same access key, and I got in. Difficult, but not impossible. Now we're moving down the ladder to the token reuse. This is a bit easier. I rate it as medium complexity. Again, you have a website, or in this case, a mobile app that allows a user to sign in either using Google or Facebook. Same thing, after authentication, you'll be asked if you want to proceed. If you got the correct Facebook user ID and password, doesn't matter if you have MFA, whatever not, as long as you have made the authentication successful, you'll be asked if you want to continue. And this is the part where it goes into step number 5, where the vulnerable parameters are parsed into the resource server. Now, for this instance, what we abused was the access key token. This is the key that was granted by the authorization server, in this case, Facebook. What we did was, instead of using the key that was given by abc.com, we decided to use another website's key, in this case, Coursera. It's just an example. I'm not saying that Coursera is vulnerable to this attack. I'm just using Coursera's key to see if I'm able to reuse this key on abc.com. All right, so over here, I've used the Facebook access token debugger to just show you how the Coursera token looks like. This is the part where step number 5, after intercepting the packets that goes between the client application to the web server. The token over here, the access token that I highlighted over here, actually belongs to Coursera. It does not belong to abc.com. So what I did was I used Coursera's access key to access abc.com website. And this website, instead of using the set token, it just grants you the access token in the body of the response. It's the same thing. It just depends on how the website developer has developed the website. In some cases, they set the token in the cookie. In this case, they set the token in the body of the application. important thing to note here is that we are not using abc.com's access token. We are using Coursera, meaning I've authenticated against Coursera and I took Coursera's key, access key, to access abc.com. So the problem here is that abc.com is not checking this parameter, the access token key. It's not checking. As long as it's valid, doesn't matter which site it comes from, it will happily give you access. So it's like I'm going to Mike's house using Julie's keys. Doesn't make sense, right? If I want to go to Mike's house, I should be using Mike's key. Now, have a look at the next slide. This is how token reuse exploit could happen in the wild. We have an app, a website that was specially created by this evil hacker. He creates a website that's so believable. It could be a very popular website. You know, again, I could say Coursera, maybe not, any website that's popular. And he is just, how they say, enticing or waiting for users, victims, to authenticate against his website. So for example, if you like to go to O'Reilly.com, you like to log in using OAuth, and O'Reilly.com happened to be a compromised website owned by a hacker, he would just happily collect all the keys, the access tokens that get passed from the victim into his tiny little database here, which he can collect. And as long as that key is valid, he will be able to reuse that key on another resource server, in this case, abc.com. So again, it depends on how long is the validity of the access key granted by this hacker control website. In this case, I say it's O'Reilly.com. Just for example, yeah, fictitiously. I'm not saying that it's compromised. It can be any website. So this is how a typical, or I would say something that could probably happen in the wild, out there, in the wild west, in the World Wide Web, where hackers are actually collecting your access token and actively spraying it on other websites. Could be. Now, moving down the ladder, easy. Yeah, this exploitation technique is considered easy because the only thing that needs to get tampered is the resource ID. We'll examine this in a bit more of detail. Over here, you have another website with the same authentication mechanisms. Use Facebook or Google or traditional username or password. We choose Facebook. So as long as you have a Facebook account, a valid Facebook account, you click yes, continue. This is the part, step number 5. As I showed you in the previous diagram, we use Burp Suite, we capture the traffic, and we are going to tamper just one value, which happened to be the resource ID. In this case, it was the username. Everything else remains the same. So by tampering the username, which happens to be an email, even easier. So I tamper to using the second account that I created, user 002, for example, and I would have access into the victim's account, abc.com. I'll show you another example where I tamper, again, the username, in this case, an email address, and I have access again into another user's account. So going one step back, Jian Ling's account, again, these accounts are owned by us. And now I got access to Ganyu's Ling account just by changing his username. The others over here, authentication token, remain the same. So therefore, all you need is a valid session from the authorization server with a valid username. Okay, so you can brute force the username as much as you want until you find the correct user ID that exists in the victim server, and voila, you will get access into the server as long as the access token here is valid. Simple as that. And this is how the resource server page will look like after you have gained access into the system. So I mentioned about Jan Link's account. Yep. So I gained access. I have access to his profile. I could have access to his credit card numbers if any numbers were stored on the server, on the resource server. Again, fictitious website called abc.com. Now, moving down the fourth step, which is the easiest at the bottom of the ladder. This is the pot swingers apprentice lab that I mentioned in the first slide, where you just have to modify one parameter and not bother about the other parameters that go along with it, because there are no other parameters. Again, fictitious website, login with Facebook. Step number 5. Sorry there, my webcam decided to fall. All right, so where was I? Yes, I mentioned this is by far the easiest exploitation technique ever found out there in the wild, because you only have to modify one simple parameter, which is the client email address, which is nearly the same as the third one I showed you just now. But if you notice on the left side here, there are no other parameters required. There is no access token. There is no cookies, no session, nothing. Or you can practically bookmark this website and come back again and just replay this whole session by just changing the user ID, which happened to be the client client email address that's registered at the website. And over here, you see the response: the set cookies have been granted, meaning you have access to the resource server. So no complexity of having a valid access token, no complexity of having app user ID that's valid. No session is required. All you need is to just send a user ID or send a valid email address, and the victim website will happily grant you access to the resource server. This is an apprentice level, the easiest. We have seen this in the wild. Again, if it was a BBP program, I don't think it will survive more than 5 minutes. It's just too easy. And this is how it looks like, the resource server after you have gained access, just by modifying the parameter, the user ID or email parameter, and you have gained access into the resource server. And if the resource server has any private PII data, credit card numbers, you would have access to the victim's data. So you can see how easy it gets from from the most difficult one, step number 4, down the ladder to the last step at the bottom. It just depends on how the website was developed and whether or not the parameters that get transferred between the client application to the resource server is actually checked. So it's easy, it's high impact. It can be performed using different authorization servers. It doesn't necessarily have to be Facebook. It could be Google, it could be Twitter. We decided to use Facebook because Facebook access tokens are, my opinion, easier to debug, has a validity period. It doesn't have a CSRF token attached to it, so I can happily reuse it. Attacker will have full control once accessing the resource server. It's considered account takeover, and therefore stealing the victim's identity, and it could be used for fraudulous or criminal acts. Depends on what the hacker's goal is. All right, so we come to the end of my disclosure over here. I will be taking questions, and I will try my best to answer. This is my email address over here. And okay, guys, hack the planet.